My grandparents' first child was Fred. He was born in 1866. By the time of Fred's birth, I think that a good portion of the fields had been cleared, although I don't think that it was finished by any means. But as the children came along, they all worked on the farm at an early age. My dad only went to the third grade because he was needed on the farm, and my grandfather couldn't spare him. But my father was one of the youngest ones. And so these older boys and gals who worked in the house and the garden and did the milking and so forth, plenty to do without working in the fields. But anyway, the older boys then all worked in the fields, planting and harvesting crops. And in the winter they worked in the woods, cutting trees and skidding them to the river. So they had a year-round job without mercy, that's for sure. But as the years rolled by, I'd say probably at the turn of the century, the other events were interfering with this not so idyllic life. And the main one was the railroads. By 1880, railroads had come into Clearfield, which was 20 miles away. And by 1900, they were passing down along the river near Granddad's farm and the locality around there. And of course, the railroad offered jobs that paid money. These farm jobs that Grandpa offered his children didn't pay, and I don't know if he shared the timber profits or not, but I suspect that the boys were not contented with the income that they were getting. And so when the railroad came, that gave an opportunity not only, as I mentioned, for local jobs, but also to travel to other parts of the country. Coincidentally, the automotive industry and other industries were beginning to bloom in regions such as Akron, Ohio, and Detroit, with Henry Ford and his nascent operation there, and others too were beginning to tinker with the rudimentary automobiles of that day. And with passenger service, and so as the older ones grew to maturity, Akron was a favorite, it seems, because my Aunt Belle left, and Uncle Frank and Uncle Jewel, and Hector went to Detroit to work for Henry Ford, and Uncle Ed went to Williamsport to work there, eventually as a baker, I understand. Dad told me he remembers the day that Uncle Ed left the farm, never to return. Uncle Ed had been prospecting for a job, and he thought he could get one in Williamsport, which is about 100 miles away. And he was expecting a letter confirming his employment. And they were working at the end of the long field below the house. And the mailman came, and one of the girls came running across the field with a letter for Ed. And it was for his employment, and he was to report immediately. So Dad said he literally ran back to the house and got his rags and walked the 2 miles over to the train station and caught the train to Williamsport. And the only time he returned was for a periodic visit. I remember Uncle Ed. He had an inherited tumor syndrome, and I have some myself on my arms, and I can't remember the name of the tumor, but they're watery tumors that form under the skin. I remember when I was a kid, Uncle Ed came over to visit us. These tumors were large on his arm, size of eggs anyway, under the skin, and they hung down. And he'd hold his arm out and shake them, and they'd flop around. As a young child, I was fascinated by that apparition. My dad was born in 1886. Around 1908 or so, he began to apprentice to be a telegraph operator. Of course, it was unpaid, and he had to learn himself on how to do it. And he and cousin Alfred both got telegraph keys, and they ran a telegraph line between their houses and learned the Morse code. So by 1911, then my dad was a full-time telegrapher on the New York Central Railroad. My father was unable to go to school past the third grade, and he went to the same one-room school that I did. But he was only permitted to go to the third grade because of the needs of his father on the farm. With the older brothers leaving for places far and wide, the labor supply on the farm really was seriously diminished. And Grandpa still wanted to maintain the farm as he had during his younger days. And so the younger boys had to take up the slack. My dad, unfortunately, wasn't able to continue. But my father learned penmanship, and these examples illustrate the beauty of his work and skill. And he had a grasp of the fundamental subjects, such as geography, and he had a relatively good grasp of basic math, not algebra, but he knew long division and so forth. I don't think he ever learned to do square roots, or never had any need to, but he certainly was capable of doing bookwork, as his work on the railroad in later years at Carthus, where he was the shipping agent as well as the telegraph operator. I've seen his workmanship in calculating the freight rates and so forth, and keeping records and so forth. He was always neat and careful in the sense of being responsible for the accuracy of his work. And he was smart. I didn't appreciate or didn't think about that in my younger years, but in retrospect, the decisions he made and the calculations that he did in his daily work, and he was ingenious and was handy with his tools and his hands. Farm work there was really pretty brutal in the sense of being physical, and everything demanded physical effort. There weren't any machines or any electricity. I remember the harvesting of the hay, which was a vital necessity for winter feed for the cattle and horses. Hay was cut and dried in the fields and raked over several times to turn it over to be sure that it was dry before it was put in the barn. Otherwise, damp hay put in the haymow would mold, or in some cases would generate enough exothermic heat to set the barn on fire. Of course, it had to be cut by using a scythe or the cradle, and then after it was raked over a couple of times and dried and piled as high as men on the ground could throw it up into horse-drawn wagons. There was a man on the wagon packing it down and making the load so they could haul as much as they could into the barn at one time. And then when they got into the barn, they had to fork it off of the wagon into the haymow. So it was a labor-intensive job, and it took several men to do it. It was impossible for one man to make hay, and the neighbors would cooperate with each other and help get their hay in, because it was really important to have the feed prepared and in the barn by the time the winter came. I remember the air being filled with little bits of chaff and so forth that came off the hay and filled the barn, and the sun shining through the cracks in the barn walls would illuminate the air that was so filled with this these dusty particles. As I mentioned, farm work was really hard work, all manual. For example, the corn harvest consisted of manually cutting each stalk with a handheld miniature scythe, which is just really a stick with a sharp blade at right angles on one end, and whack each stalk off at ground level, and then stack the stalks together until they dried. And usually after the frost, then the stacks of corn, which were called shocks, were hauled into the barn on the wagon with a team of horses and spread out on the barn floor, and then a group of men would sit around and pull the ears off of the stalks and take the husks off of each ear. It was a laborious job, and usually done with kind of a party or something. A group of men would sit around and kept conversation and distracted them from the monotony. This is an original tool used by my grandfather and father, or whoever was doing husking on the farm. I can't know specifically whose it was, but it's original, and it's at least 150 years old, and it's fit like this. You pierce the top of the ear along the grains and just rip down through, and it split the husk off of the ear, and could be easily removed, then breaking it off at the root of the ear. But anyway, nothing was easy. The hay and the wheat and the other grain crops were harvested with a cradle, and this picture shows the cradle being used, and It consisted of a scythe, which was a curved handle, wooden handle curved to fit the natural swing and position of the operator, and then about a 3 foot long sharpened blade at right angles at the bottom of it. That was, the scythe just consisted of those two basic pieces, whereas a cradle had a right angle arm with fingers that extended along the length of the blade, and as the whole assembly was swung, the fingers would guide the cut stalks of grain, and as he swung around, he could lay them in a row behind him. That made the secondary operation of picking up those stalks of grain and stacking them together to dry in the fields much easier and quicker. But the back-breaking work of swinging that relatively heavy scythe and finger assembly thousands of times a day must have been, well, it took a good man to do it, that's for sure. These people put together showing the use of the cradle. I don't have permission to use it, but I hope I'll be forgiven for using it. I'm showing the attribution, though, and I didn't think my explanation was good enough to really show the back-breaking labor that it took to harvest the grains in the old days. And this was typical up through well into the 20th century. Working in the woods was very difficult. In the winter, of course, the snow and the cold weather kept the flies and bugs down, but during the summer it was almost intolerable in the woods if you were working, because of your sweat, and the odor of your sweat attracted these little nasty bugs of various sorts. But the worst one was a little fly, a blue-colored fly, and it stung. It was a very it was more sharp pain than a mosquito bite. I remember, about 25 years ago, I was back to Frenchville during the summer vacation, and my cousin Tom and I decided to drive back into the mountains behind Frenchville. Something to do, spend some time with Tom and in our old native woods. But anyway, we drove back down through very, very sparsely populated there and dirt roads. There was something at a little bridge that Tom wanted to show me or something. I don't remember why we stopped, but we got out of the car and we walked back up the road a little distance, and we soon encountered a swarm of these little blue flies, and we had to retreat back into the car. They got so numerous, and the stinging was so uncomfortable that they drove us out of there. The men that worked and cut the timber, of course, didn't have any escape, and the fact that those hills back there were so steep, it was difficult to understand how they could even stand upright and cut the trees with these crosscut saws. My dad and I used to go out in the woods when I was a kid and gather up firewood. We'd cut up trees that had fallen. We never cut a live tree for firewood, but there are always plenty of deadfalls that we could use. Of course, we cut them up into 18-inch or so lengths so that they could be split into firewood for Mom to start the fire in the mornings. We didn't burn wood in the house for general heat. We used coal for that purpose. But Mom needed firewood to start the fire in the mornings, because coal is not easily ignited, and it took heat to ignite the coal in the stove. So this firewood had to be easily ignited with paper and match. So I had experience then on one end of that crosscut saw as a kid, and there's a rhythm that has to be developed. Each one has to pull, but not push. If you push, you put a buckle in the saw and causes it to bind. So you have to depend on your partner to pull it away from you, and then of course when his stroke is done, you immediately pull toward you and alternate that way. And two good skilled crosscut men can saw a tree or a log pretty rapidly, but if you're not very skilled or zero skill like I was, I got more than one word of admonishment from my father to quit pushing, but I soon developed the rhythm, and we did pretty well. Sometime during the 1960s, Dad and I were talking about the old settlers around there and where they lived and so forth, because many of the buildings have long disappeared. And our conversation prompted him to think about it in much more detail after I left, and to draw this map here in this video. From the names that he told me about and the research that I've done, it looks like about 200 souls lived in this roughly 2 square mile region, 1875, or at the time of his birth in 1886. For some reason it was called Germany, and I haven't been able to find anybody who originated that, but that's what it was called all the time that I was alive there, and even now. So that's another unanswered question. But at this point in time, in 2022, there's only one family living there full time now, and the rest of the buildings indicated here on the list have as destroyed or hunting camps. So it's a pretty empty place back there. Of course, the school's long been abandoned, and it's going to destruction too. By the turn of the century, in 1900, the introduction of the railroad began the precipitous downfall of that whole community. And of course, the loss of 4 of Grandpa and Grandma's sons during the first 20 years, and the death of Grandma in 1922, and of course loss of the house later that year, left Grandpa alone, and of course he died in 27. So in 1928 and 29 and 30, the house was vacant. Of course, in 1930, Mom and Dad had to move back there because of the Depression. But the decline of the farm was really precipitated by the introduction of the railroads. Not only the Ruggie farm, but the whole community. The third generation of young people in that area knew there wasn't any future there, and they all emigrated to various parts of the world via the railroad. So by the time Dad and Mom moved back because of the Depression and the crash of the economy in 1930, Dad didn't have any equipment or horses or anything, and farming in the 30s was a lost cause because of the Depression and the lack of economy. The farm and the whole community began to be abandoned. And of course now today, as I mentioned earlier, there's only one family that lived back there. It's a far cry from the 1800s, when 200 that I'd estimated lived there had disappeared, died, moved away. But all this loss meant that there wasn't anybody else remaining to live on the farm. And that began the long decline to the point where it is today. The only existing building anymore is the granary. By the time I was born, the barn was already leaking. It had all the buildings had wooden shingles on them, and I remember as a little child seeing dripping down on the plank floor of the barn floor, and it eventually ate a hole through the plank over the years, and the other timbers rotted away, and when we sold it in the 60s, the new owner immediately tore it down and salvaged what he could out of it. Today, in 2020, the fields have been reclaimed by the white pine and other less desirable growth, so that the fields themselves now have disappeared under the canopy of a new forest. And the house that Dad built for his father in 1924, the last time I saw it, had structural failure on the right rear corner. The place that gave Grandpa and great-grandpa their start and prosperity has returned to nature, primarily because of the poor soil there. That ancient forest contributed nothing to the fertility of the ground. The acidic leaves and needles and so forth didn't generate good topsoil, and the ground itself, not nice soil, full of little flat types of slate-like stones. There aren't any farms anymore in that region. I'm going to interrupt the general continuity of my story here with the interjection of pictures and comments taken in July 2022 on a return trip to Frenchville in my son John's new Tesla, to give you a comparison of what the farm looks like today, 100 years after what this video has shown, and how nature has demanded its retribution for the efforts that great-grandfather and grandfather put into this place in the 1800s. On July 15th, 2022, one of my sons in his Tesla offered to take me back to Frenchville. I gladly accepted. So we left on Friday morning and drove up there, arrived there the evening at a very nice place along a lake where he had rented a condo. It was a beautiful place in the woods near Dubois. Then the next day, Saturday morning, we got up early and drove down to Frenchville, which was about 30 miles further east, and was able to see the old house and places where I was raised. The original house that stood on this foundation was built probably in the 1860s or so. After the house burned down in 1922, my grandfather lived with his various children for a while, but didn't like that at all. So in the fall of 1924, my dad took over a month off work and built this house on top of the existing foundation. And so he lived here until he died at the age of 92 in 1927. And the house stood empty then until roughly January or so of 1930. After the crash of 29, my dad's job disappeared as a telegraph operator on the railroad. The whole economy collapsed and he had no work. And so in order to survive, and he was a newly married man, married just about a year or so before that. I was born in April 1929, about 6 months before the crash. This is where I childhood and youth. But I know Dad and Mom both had reason to be depressed and fearful of the future. So their marriage got off to a rocky start, to say the least. Did fix up the interior, put some cardboard-like paneling on the interior walls. This house is built with plank construction. It's not studs at all. The first layer of planks ran vertically, and then the horizontal layer of clapboards was nailed on the outside. So it had very thin and certainly no insulation on exterior walls. And it didn't have a porch then either when they moved in. So it was, as you can see from the picture that I've included, it was a pretty bare building. So Mom was a secretary at the Prudential office in Phillipsburg, and she was pitched into this dismal hole here in Frenchville, and that's where she spent the rest of her life too, in this place. In 1961, my dad died. He didn't have a lot of money, but my mother wanted the house to look better, and she wanted some more conveniences. Agreed to take a month off from work at Louisville, and I got permission from my boss to do it. And so I applied this masonite siding to the house, and then I put a new roof on it. I nailed shingles over the whole roof, and I rebuilt the front and back porch. Installed a coal-fired furnace with electric dampers to control the fire to a pretty good degree. I installed a propane cooking stove, and then I installed an automatic washer and dryer for her. Ran a plumbing for that, and I did some other things too. I'm sure I can't recall just at the moment, but anyway, I worked my tail off that month. But I did all that within a month, and it made her more comfortable because she lived there by herself. This place is really isolated. It's 2 miles to the paved road, and the neighbors were not friendly. I only recall ever once the neighbor came to visit my mother. My sister's bedroom was under the front dormer there, and mine was in the behind the double windows on this end of the house. And the kitchen was to the left lower window corner, and the living room was at the right right end corner window here, where I'm pointing. And one night we were sitting at the table, kitchen table there, behind the window there on the lower left. And as an aside, my father always spoke French to Ruth and my sister. And of course he spoke English to Mom, and Mom spoke English to everybody. So at the table there was a bilingual conversation going on. Sure wish I had a tape recorder to record that. That must have been something to hear. But my mother understood French, so we couldn't pull anything funny on her, but she never spoke it. But anyway, one summer evening, well, at the table, I sat with my back to the window, and my sister faced the window on the opposite side of the table. My mother sat on my right, and my dad sat on my left. So one summer evening, we're eating supper, and Ruth looked out the window, and she said, "Un chef mange le jardin." And my dad, of course, knew what that meant. That meant that a deer is eating in the garden. And he looked out, he saw the deer, so he jumped right up and he ran over to the corner of the kitchen behind the stove where the rifles and guns were stacked in the corner. So he grabbed the .32 Winchester and some shells off of the shelf there and ran up the stairs to my bedroom, and I followed him right on his heels. And we looked out the left double window there, I remember, and sure enough, the deer was still there. And so he raised his rifle, and there was a screen in the window, and he fired right through the screen at that deer. And of course, he hit it right in the shoulder where he wanted to, and dropped right there. But the sound of that gun going off in that room sounded like a 80mm cannon going off. But of course, it was in the summer and illegal, and so we hastened down to drag it into the basement, get it out of sight, and get the skin off of it and bury it some below the house there in the swamp, or the old dam, and cut the meat up and get it butchered in rapid haste. The game wardens in those days, and they may still be, draconian. If they caught you poaching and a deer in your car, state law said that you lose the car and the gun and a $500 fine. And those were really draconian effects during the Depression. $500 is more than a lot of people made in a year, certainly more than Dad made in a couple of years subsequent to the move there. And the winters were very brutal during that period of time, in addition to the other difficulties. This is a view along the south side of the house. I painted that house in 1961 when I put the masonite siding on it, and I don't think it's been painted ever since. So you're looking at 60 some years of weathering. So the paint must not have been too bad. And looking east toward Alfred's, and the summer kitchen would have been immediately to the right of the concrete top of the well, and the woodshed and the outhouse would have been further on the left. I'm talking to Mike Merritt about the electric pole. I remember the day that the hole was dug for that pole in 1939, and the guy that dug it was Hilary Billet, and he was a local guy, and he and I had a conversation about the